me? Know how I earn a living? I'll catch this bird for you, but it ain't gonna be easy. Bad fish. This shark, swallow you whole. A little shaking, a little tenderizing, and down you go. We gotta do it quick. Bring all the tourists back and put your businesses on a paying basis. But it ain't gonna be pleasant. I value my neck a lot more than $3,000, Chief. I'll find them for 3, but I'll catch them and kill them for 10. Now you gotta make up your minds. You wanna stay
Yes, I'm grounded, got my wings clipped. I'm surrounded by all this pavement. Guess I'll circle while I'm waiting for my fuse to dry. Someday I'll fly, someday I'll soar. Someday I'll be so damn much more. Surrounded by all this pavement. I guess I'll circle while I'm waiting for my fuse to dry. Wait for the fuse to dry. Someday I'll fly, someday I'll soar. Someday I'll be so damn much more. When you try your best but you don't succeed, when you get what you want but not what you need, when you feel so tired but you can't sleep, stuck in reverse, and the tears come streaming down your face, when you lose something you can't replace, when you love someone but it goes to waste, could it be worse? Life Lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. High up above or down below, when you're too in love to let it go. But if you never try, you'll never know just what you were. Lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. Tears stream down your face when you lose something you cannot replace. Tears stream down your face, tears stream down your face. I promise you I'll learn from my mistakes. Tears stream down your face, lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. cards exchanged, no time to exchange when all the little lambs are marching, red and black and ten are waving. They all do it the same. They all do it the same way. County mountains, sing my thoughts about sweet tooth, talks it over right around. Program a cup, sing the corners and loose and cap, cap on the fence, could not to a fan. Cut, take these chances, place them in the box and take quiet at time, lights down, you're up and
This music stream is sponsored by Mozy Online Backup. Ever had a hard drive crash? Left your laptop in the taxi? For less than $5 a month, Mozy protects your digital photos, music, and other valuable computer files against computer disaster. Visit mozy.com.
Hey everybody, if you could grab your seats. Let me just give you a quick rundown of how we're doing things today. This morning we have a panel on open educational resources in an era of budget constraints or something like that. That's going to go for about an hour. Then we have a break. Then we have kind of an open forum. Cole's going to run that and basically open it up to the floor, what's coming down the road, what you should be paying attention to, kind of what's on the horizon. Then we're going to have lunch, and after the lunch we have 2 rounds of lightning talks, 5 minutes each. There is a cowbell somewhere hidden, I think, and you should fear the cowbell if you're giving a lightning talk. So with that, I'll hand this over to Matt. And Brett, do you want to talk about the mugs?
We got tons of mugs here, folks. So sometime before the end of the day, if you want 2, 3, 10, come on down, and we've got them here. We've got plenty of boxes. Don't be shy.
Candle throws its light into the darkness. In a nasty world, so shines a good deed.
All right. Good morning. I'm Matt Meyer. I'm an instructional designer with the ETS group. Today's morning session is Learning Design in an Era of Resource Constraints and Free Information. We're going to talk about openness, using content use and reuse, copyright, those types of things with the panel here. On our panel, we have Alan Gorky, who's going to be we're going to call him our instigator today, because he's going to try to instigate some things with this panel. We have Keith Bailey, who's from the College of Arts and Architecture, the E-Learning Institute. Mike Furlow, Library's Assistant Dean for Scholarly Communications. Jeanette Novakovich, Liberal Arts English, and Hoy is Associate Professor of Business Law from the Smeal Business College. So I think to get things Alan has lined up a long bunch of videos to get the day going here. Alan, do you want to get us started?
If you don't know me very well, I like romantic comedies and buddy films and inspirational things. So I figured at the beginning of most movies you see coming attractions. So this movie's something that I'm kind of interested in. So
meet Jack Torrance.
I'm outlining a new writing project.
He's a writer looking for inspiration.
Lots of ideas. No good ones.
Meet Danny.
It's a torch.
He's a kid looking for a dad.
There's hardly anybody to play with around here.
What's that, Doc?
Jack just can't finish his book.
I don't want to sound melodramatic, but there's no way to make it economically feasible.
Here's to 5 miserable months.
But now, sometimes what we need the most is just around the corner.
I'm your new foster father.
I'd do anything.
Climbing up on Salisbury Hill,
I love it.
I could see the city light. My heart going boom, boom, boom. Son, he said, grab your things, I've come to take you home.
Shining.
what do you guys think? Should I go see that? My point is that that's a remix. There's the song in the background. There's the clip from The Shining. Actually, scenes remixed from the movie, and it is a completely different take. So, does that fall under the bounds of fair use? Is that a parody? It does definitely change the meaning, but it is using copyrighted work for that purpose. So I also wanted to kick off things with some video here from Creative Commons, which explains the idea of fair use and remixing in much better way than I could, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel. And I just think these are the things that we should be talking about this morning, because there are always questions from students about can they use an audio clip, and it depends on how you use it. Can they use a video clip? It depends on how you use it. So.
Creativity always builds on the past. Creativity always builds on the past.
Yeah, Creative Commons website does have a license generator. And you just basically specify, let's see, license. You specify how you want, a work to be used. So you can decide, do you want commercial uses of your work used, yes or no? I tend to choose no because I use Creative Commons on my photos. So no, allow modifications of your work. Yes, as long as others share alike. So in other words, if I put my photos out there and Chris Long takes them and uses them in his class, I just want to make sure that whatever product he makes based on those photos is also shared. We're all in the United States. And that's all I have to do, really. Then I do select the license, and it gives me the by, which means it gives me attribution, non-commercial, and share alike. So that's the license I typically use. You'll see a lot of people today, and in fact, I found this lovely photo taken yesterday by Stevie Rocco. And actually, it was taken by Gentry, wasn't it? Yeah. And she has, I know that I can use this. I could use this and print calendars and make money off of it if I wanted to, because she has Creative Commons, some right reserved, and by, which means I just need to give her attribution. I have to say I got this from Stevie Rocco and maybe give her Flickr user ID and account. So basically, if you want, I guess my message is that there have been a lot of discussions about open educational resources and using content repositories and meta tagging and things like that. But I'm finding that a lot of faculty, about a third of our faculty at the university, are using open materials already. They're already using YouTube. They're already using photos from Flickr. And that's one of the best. These open repositories are the best, in my opinion, repositories for open educational resources. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Great, thanks, Alan. I love some of the imagery in that video where they're basically saying, showing the imagery of the American flag and the word free, and basically, it's an American ideal to get free stuff, apparently. So I really like that. So what I want to do is have the panel, we'll just go right down the line here, introduce themselves and talk about what they do and how it relates to the topics of this panel, so you can get a flavor for where they're coming from. So we'll start with Dan.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Dan Cahoy. So I'm an associate professor of business law, which I guess that was already introduced. So my background is in intellectual property. I'm actually a patent lawyer by training, and I teach intellectual property law at the Smeal College. So my connection to this topic is not only as a teacher, but it is as a teacher because in explaining some of the concepts, explaining some of the law, some of the cases, I like to use a lot of multimedia. So I have the same interest that any other instructor or professor has. But I also have a research interest in this, so I find the whole area fascinating. And when you have discussions of fair use and Creative Commons licensing, my ears sort of perk up. I have some thoughts already, but I don't want to dominate initially, so I'll dominate at the end. That's what lawyers always do. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. So anyway, but I'm excited to be on this panel, and I think this will be an interesting discussion.
And I'm Mike Furlow from the libraries, and I'm also really glad to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be here the last 2 days. I was in a 2-day annual retreat that the library administration has to look at budget and planning for the coming year, so a lot of what I have to say will relate to the issue of the era of resource constraints as we talk through this today. My job my title is the Assistant Dean for Scholarly Communications, and by Scholarly Communications, we usually are really referring to a broad system that is economic and technical and social and political and any other area of study you want to put onto it, that it supports the dissemination, the creation, and the preservation of research and knowledge. Most often it's used to talk about research, but it really bleeds into the teaching arena as well. So I look over programs that can help support the creation of original materials, support their dissemination, help work with faculty to advise them on publishing resources or publishing activities, or how to get their material online, or to effectively reach their audiences. I collaborate with the Penn State Press on a lot of this, and also with various areas within ITS and faculty as well. So I also care a lot about this issue. I think the universities don't do enough to promote openness and open use and open dissemination of content by far. But I think that there are other issues that weigh against that, because openness is one thing that, and among many, that the administration of your university is worried about at any given moment, and it often ends up getting pushed to the side for other reasons. So I can talk a little bit more about that as we go.
Keith Bailey, Director of e-learning for the College of Arts and Architecture, and my perspective is maybe a little bit different, but I'm very reliant on these two to help us get to where we need to be as an academic college to be able to display and use media. I kind of feel that we're in a little bit of a unique situation in the arts where a lot of what is being taught is very visual, obviously, and is very reliant on media to support the courses. So, you know, the past 4 years I've spent an awful lot of time digging around and trying to figure out what Teach Act actually means, how you actually use it, how does fair use start to play into the picture, how can you use that, and then figuring out from a technical side, how do you implement that at a college level, and when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of enrollments in an academic year, how do you ensure that you are protecting these materials appropriately? Last year, I was talking about this, and I think I probably had a very different take than I do today. And hopefully we can talk about some of those takes. And there are some big happenings that are coming about right now with regard to fair use. And I would love to hear some more perspectives on that. And hopefully in the next year we have a much clearer picture as to how we can do a lot of this. I mean, most of this it's not fair how in the classroom everything seems to be fair game. When you move online, it's no longer fair game. And that's very frustrating. So.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Novakovich, and I teach in the English department. I'm going to show you I'm using the blogs platform, to teach 202C technical writing. And so I guess I'm the practitioner here in the group. Let's see. I have just a brief slideshow. This is my course website. So I do share my course materials with other professors, and it is online. I have I can't open that, shoot. And the last page, I have each of my students also creates a website, and they publish their work in progress and their final papers online. And last semester, this summer, the students created a website as a community. We did video screencast tutorials, teaching advanced users of blogs how to do special things like create PDF containers, post audio files, and so we have tutorials there. And my students, basically, they each have their own website. This is a student website, and this is a paper. And so they're publishing their work online. They're very aware of that. And you can see the professionalism, the detail with design work. And I think this is where we'll probably step into Creative Commons problems where they take images offline. And we always talk about that during the semester. And then we've made assignments. This is a traditional resume transformed into a web resume. And this is my teaching example. I actually created this for my son, and you have audio here on the website. You have I'm going to add a video, and it's really dynamic. And so this is how we're using that open resource platform. So that's the, thank you.
All right, great. We'll go right to the question tool, and the first one here is from, it looks like the second one too is from Stevie, so we'll start with the first one. In an era of free information, how is Penn State embracing openness and still position itself as a viable institution of education? And I think, Mike, this follows up on something you were talking about where you don't think the institution is really doing enough to promote it. So maybe you guys can, we'll pass this, or you can maybe start this and answer that.
I don't know if I can answer it, but I'll at least throw some ideas out there. I want to think about this for a second. I think that one of the ways that the institution can and is embracing openness is through grassroots efforts like this, by kind of drawing attention to the fact that, in fact, we are all using open information and we are generally willing to share the materials we create in most instances and in most cases. I think that there are always going to be exceptions to that, but I think it does have to come from example from the community of users to help make it clearer to other parts of the institution what that means and what the stake is. Where I think the viability issue comes in is in how, as an institution, are we positioned to support what you want to do as instructors, as researchers, as teachers, and students, so that it will endure and so that we can afford to do it effectively, and so that it'll still be there next year when you come back for it and you want to teach that class. I think those are the kind of the nubs here. It's that what we are working towards in this room and in this whole in the past several years is more effective uses of technology in teaching to make teaching better, to make research better, to make learning better. That's the focus. But these are new costs that come into it, and they compete with existing activities. And those existing activities, people have a hard time giving them up. So that in an era of resource constraint like we have right now, and like we're going to be in for a couple of years, new initiatives are critical because they help move the institution forward, but they will be disadvantaged without some careful thought about how they move ahead. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, you know, how do we move ourselves forward as a university? And last year we had the discussion around, you know, how do we move forward as a whole? And I don't know if we necessarily at this point in time can. I mean, we're a rather large university, and individually, I think we have to start thinking about what does it mean for us individually to start to participate in the open world, and how do you do that? And everybody will probably do it a little differently because each of the colleges have a very different culture associated to the material that's out there. E-Education has opened up all of their course materials, and that works very well for them. In our case, we couldn't do that because of copyright limitations, right? So we've taken a very different approach to it. We do a lot of video shooting now. We put everything up in iTunes University. And we make those materials accessible that way. So other colleges, how can you go about doing it? Well, is a syllabus a viable way of putting an open source out there? We don't necessarily need to think about how MIT has done their university-wide open educational resources, but how can we do it individually and start to make large improvements? Another interesting aspect to this is that the university has through its history, has created a very closed environment. We have this thing called the Courseware Copyright Agreement. What does that do? Well, that puts a faculty member in a panic right up front. You are taking my material, and you are telling me it's yours. Now, with the help of what ETS has done in the past year, now we have Creative Commons as a license to be used. Creative Commons 3.0 is a license to be used at the university. So what does that allow us to do? We close it. Now we open it. So academically, your deans in each of the colleges have the ability to turn around and say, we want to open that material. Well, how are we going to open it? Well, we're going to put a Creative Commons license on top of it, and we're now going to say, thank you, we've closed it, we're now reopening it up to the world. And you have the determination to make that happen locally. So we have a lot of opportunities at this point, and hopefully what we're seeing is a small cultural shift within the university that can kind of keep moving, and maybe at some point we can start to unify on what it actually means to be open education, but we're not going to get a couple $1 million like MIT did to open up all that material. And it's going to start with faculty opening their minds and saying, boy, you know what, I get a lot more visibility by opening up my material. I'm starting to present more all over the world, and this is doing a lot more professionally for me than keeping it closed to my 25 students in the classroom.
So one way I think the university can concretely open things up from an educational perspective is to better define faculty ownership of materials, and I think the university is working to do that. Not a lot of people think about this, but under copyright law, what you create in the scope of your employment is owned by your employer. So as a start-off matter, a faculty member does not have the right to put a Creative Commons license on their material if it's owned by the university. I mean, the license is in fact meaningless. That's if the material is actually owned by the university. So what the university can do is they can better define when you own materials that you create, scholarship versus instruction materials. And they've done that in the past, and I think there are probably some future initiatives the university is looking toward to perhaps give faculty more ownership of their instruction materials. But that's a very, very concrete step, and I think it's going to be a huge step forward in increasing open education.
I just wanted to add to that in fact, over the past year, there had been a new faculty committee with administrators and also a membership from an outside legal counsel to look at the university's intellectual property policies around teaching materials. And I've seen drafts of what they were working on and sat in on a couple of conversations as an interested party. And they really were looking at it from a much different perspective than I think the university did 10 years ago. And one of the themes that I think came through in the conversation was that policies that were written around courseware 10 years ago were based on the assumption that there was a lot of money to be made out of electronic resources online and teaching online and so forth. And in fact, it's really, really difficult and expensive to make money off of that. It's more expensive than you're going to get back from it. So now I can't tell you where that group is in moving their work forward. I don't know at this point because I would have expected it to be done by now. But this is a university, and this is where everybody has a different perspective, and consensus means people can gum up the works if they don't agree with the way things are moving. So I don't want to diminish the importance of what they're doing, but I just want to say it's probably going to be slower coming than we would like on that.
Here's Alan.
I've heard this a couple of times now. One of the biggest threats to faculty isn't somebody taking their materials and running with it, it's obscurity. If you know of Michael Wesch, does anybody... Hands up, you've heard of Michael Wesch before? Okay. He doesn't have tenure. He's been working for Kansas State University for maybe 5 years now. But he just started, creating a lot of activities with his students, creating some flash presentations, putting them online, and he just won the Teacher of the Year award last year. And it's because he's embraced this idea of openness, of sharing what his class is doing and releasing his materials online. Cole and I were talking yesterday, and we're getting the same kind of feeling from what Dirk Mateer is doing. Like, he's doing such great things in his classroom, and students start spontaneously, taping that and putting it up on YouTube. And his reaction to that isn't, you're violating my intellectual property, I guess. I mean, it's a performance with other students. I don't know that it would be copyrighted per se. But he's not trying to stop that. He's embracing that. Then he took that and said, well, if students are creating and posting videos on YouTube anyway, what else can we do with this? And then the students post their materials online. So it's really an example of a cultural shift in those students. And those students are then going to go on in other courses, I would hope, and create more videos and that sort of thing. Hannah's smiling. She's worked with many of these students. I was also... Still here? Okay. I was also wondering if you could talk about the benefit of creating open materials that are shared between instructors.
Well, everything I do is open, and I think it's useful within the department. A lot of teachers will ask me questions. They do visit my website. They are basically coming up with new assignments based on some of the work I've done, and then I copy some of their work. So there really is an openness with the blogs platform, and it's very exciting. We've only been doing this one semester in a summer course, and it's just gripping everybody. A lot of people who weren't in the pilot program are starting their own, just using the blogs for assignments. It takes a lot of time to create the course website, and I probably spent a few months doing that. You can't just jump into that, but it's great because it's permanent, and you can just keep adding to it. I have videos and activities and games. They're all there online, so it is promoting openness, the blogs platform.
And this next question comes from Cole and Keith. He says, you had mentioned things are different for you since you're a designer of online courses than for those who design and teach face-to-face. So could you just elaborate on that a little bit more, what that means to you?
Sure. I think maybe the biggest area is a recent course that was developed as a film music course. And in the classroom right now, it is fair game for the faculty member to take a DVD, take it into the classroom, and show the whole thing. And there is no one that's going to come in and claim that that is incorrect because it meets the goals and the objectives of the course. But when you move it into an online environment, all of a sudden you have this thing in the TCHAC called reasonable and limited portion. Quite vague. What does that mean? What is reasonable and limited portion? And how would you define what reasonable and limited is? Now, we're taking a stance, and that's a shame we're being recorded on this, but we're kind of taking a stance that reasonable and limited is attached to the objective of the course still. So it is up to the instructor to create and argue with our instructional designers, and for the instructional designers in here, we've had several arguments about this. What is the goal, and what happens if we take a portion of that video and chop it? Do you get the full experience in the film? And especially when you're listening to the scores in the film and trying to reach the instructional objective. And the analogy that the faculty actually used was more on the lines of, well, if you took a chapter out of a book, and say it was the second to last chapter that the plot came out, and you said, well, we can't use that in the classroom because, you know, we just can't legally. Are you going to get the same impact from that book? Well, the answer is no. So the faculty member actually came in and said, we have to show the full thing. And we said, okay, fine. So our definition of reasonable and limited in this case is that we have to show the full featured film, or else the student will not gain the same experience. Unfortunately, there is no legal precedent set out there at defining what that actually means. We feel that we are in the right on doing it this way. We are taking every precaution necessary to making sure that only the students can see it. We're actually probably going to a little bit more of an extreme by pulling it down as soon as the week is over, the week of instruction. So, you know, that's probably one of the biggest differences from the face-to-face to online. But the definitions within Teach Act are so limiting in certain areas that it's not an equal transition going from face-to-face to online. And there are so many different interpretations of this. Go out to the websites and start reading it, and you just get caught up in the legal jargon out there trying to figure out what this actually means. So what we've done here at the university, we've worked with our legal counsel to figure out what it means for the university. And I guess my interpretation is that whatever they feel that they can defend in the courtroom is how they're defining what it is that we can do. And I think a further frustration for me is that this course became specific, saying that it is okay if you're in the communication department, it is not okay if you're in the arts and architecture area. I was like, well, isn't the course the same, no matter where it's being delivered? So there's still some unknowns associated to this right now. But when it comes to imaging and things like that, I mean, it's pretty much the same. The only thing is that you need to make sure that you're protecting it to the students in the course room. Do everything you can to kind of degrade it, but give the highest quality that is necessary to reach the goals in the course. And I think from our standpoint is that we've really kind of put together some documentation to say this is how we treat it, and we are consistently treating it this way. And as long as you're consistent and it's well thought out, you're probably pretty much protected. And don't be afraid to vet it with other people too, and make sure that you're on the same playing ground. I don't know if that answers.
Go ahead, Mike. I was just going to. I wanted to echo a couple of things that Keith said. I think that I was thinking about what my responsibility is in the libraries for intellectual property, and I kind of ran down four things. One is, and this is really critical for the library, we have to protect the interests of the rights holders. That's not just a legal obligation and a thing we have to do because we work in a large organization with a lot of lawyers on call. It's a moral duty for the people who produce the material. For all of you, we need to protect what rights you say you want to retain on it and so forth. Same for anything else we create or acquire. But at the same time, we have to take the fullest advantage of the law and to push as far as we can on how we would use materials in a scholarly context. So for me, that always means making sure you can justify what you're doing. And I think Keith ran down a really useful and interesting set of questions to run through, at least in relation to the Teach Act. Unfortunately, there's a whole set of guidance that comes from another governing body in the United States around the Teach Act, and their principles are a little different from that. I'm not gonna, but I don't dispute that the approach Keith has taken there is not a reasonable one. It's just maybe It sounds like when you talk to McQuaid, they had a slightly different feeling sometimes. But I think the basic thing is you have to make sure what you can clarify for others. And Keith's right. The lawyers are going to want to know what they can do to defend. Can they defend this for the university? In fact, often they are very flexible and can find useful arguments for justifying what we're doing in an educational context that takes us a little bit farther than we might expect. However, you know, we don't have case law around all this stuff, and that's where the rules really get made.
So I think one of the inherent things about copyright law is that there is a lot of ambiguity in it, and so it's not surprising there aren't some clear definitions to this. Some people would say the flexibility is actually a really good thing about it because it allows you to access things that might not fit within somebody's guidelines that were written 10 years ago. So that can be a good thing. But yeah, it does cause, I think, a lot of concern for instructors. So I guess I'd say initially I think Keith's approach is a really good one in that he's making, and his group is making a real effort to make an argument. And I think that's one of the most important things you can do is get out there and try to clarify why you think you're justified in using the material. It probably does require a little education in how the law works, so understanding how the Teach Act, you know, generally what it defines, and then how you might need to cover yourself under fair use if you don't exactly fit under the Teach Act. So it requires a little bit of effort, and I applaud Keith for actually putting in that effort, because I think the people who tend to get in trouble are those who say, it's really not my concern, or I can just use some simple terms, you know, educational use. Anything that's quote-unquote educational I can use. And that's where I think the trouble starts. Mike's point about talking to the university, though, I think is also a good one. It is true that organizations like universities tend to be relatively restrictive because they do want to protect themselves. But that doesn't mean that they are opposed to the educational goals of their institution. So I think I've always found in my interactions with university officials that they do tend to want to work and try to help and try to give access wherever possible. So starting that conversation can be a really useful thing.
Dan, you're becoming very popular here in the live question tool. Looks like you are going to be the de facto legal counsel for the learning design group that's out here, if we're not too careful. We've got a couple questions here. I'm just going to kind of mix some things up a little bit. There's one question on here for you talking about the use of Creative Commons and the conflict with PSU copyright. What I'd like to do is kind of open this question up a little bit, talk about what we see as the use of Creative Commons, the use of other media, you know, what kind of more of the perceptions that some of us have about it, and start with some of our actual experiences. And the reason I ask this, I wanted to start with Alan, because I know Alan has some thoughts on this he'd like to put out there, and then work the microphone down here to Dan and see what kind of differences we get in this, on this topic.
Anything that doesn't need to be nailed down should be free. I don't know. The Creative Commons basically is, I think the videos explained it pretty well. You know, Matt, you yourself are working on a course right now, Biology 12, which is a wet lab course. Typically, it's run in labs. They dissect flowers. They take samples. They try to determine, like, you know, if it's a blended hamburger, like what percentage of fat's in there, what percentage of protein, what percentage of carbohydrates. Right now, the students are looking at those labs, and they can go through the steps. They have to do it in a physical place, but they don't really get a sense of what that means, and they're running out of lab space. So there's two problems that Matt see. I'm just going to talk about you now, Matt. That Matt and Tyrone, where's Tyrone? Oh, there you are. That Matt and Tyrone are working together to kind of solve that problem. And what they're doing is creating online resources, you know, a movie with Tyrone talking about colony collapse disorder, and which is where the bees disappear, and what that means to the food supply, and then going into this module on pollination. So it's, you know, you're connecting it to a world issue. And did you guys use Creative Commons pictures in that with the bees and things? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So they use Creative Commons materials to help support that. Then they go into this animation. They talk about reproduction and how, you know, birds and bats and bees and the wind can pollinate plants. And then the students do a couple of activities, and then at the end it kind of wraps up, and students, you know, do some more stuff and do a write-up. All of that's being released under Creative Commons 3.0 license. So anybody can use that. And I think James Howell, is James here today? Oh, there you are. You guys submitted a grant doing a similar thing for agricultural science, right? Yeah. So they would also, so they're seeking a grant now to produce more course materials, also release them in the public, for the benefit of the public, but getting public funds to do that. I actually have another video that's related to Stevie's question about the NSF stuff, but I'll wait until the rest of this goes through. But I think it's also related because you're talking about using public funds, and then shouldn't the product also be public?
Are we going down the line?
I'm not ready.
All right. Well, let's see here. I guess, looking at the Creative Commons licensing, our goal and our hope, we have 2 courses right now that we're actually starting to look at. And, I don't know what Creative Commons license we will use. I guess we have to kind of figure that out and to what extent we can do it. But then the question comes is how do we deliver that material out and about? Do we put it in something like Connections? Do we, where is that repository that we put this in? Or do we have a mishmash of areas from which people can actually go get this material? So I think at least for the university standpoint, the fact that we have the Creative Commons license now available to start to see how people can start to use it and put it into place in the different licenses that are going to be being used is going to be very beneficial for people to be able to start to see how we go about doing that.
At the libraries, we have not adopted the use of the Creative Commons licensing for the materials that we place online for free. So, to keep in mind, the libraries acquires a number of materials, a large number of materials. They come with licenses. What we can do with them often varies from publisher to publisher. And it is not always in our heads what Elsevier allows us to do versus what Springer allows us to do versus what Project Muse allows us to do. So we very often have to go back and check license terms in order to clarify what we can do in cases of interlibrary loan or uses in course reserve or what have you. For the materials that we digitize and create ourselves or that we put online ourselves, we haven't adopted Creative Commons. It's actually something I want to explore more because I like it for the simplicity of a signal. Right, so assuming everybody knows how to read it. But the licenses that the library has, in terms of use that the library has for resources that we have on there, digitized collections and so forth, pretty much mimic the terms of a Creative Commons license for, for educational use, for sharing, for attribution. There's one more I'm forgetting here, but in a few cases we have to ask not for redistribution, though. That you need to use that copy, and that sometimes comes in because of restrictions on a gift from a donor for materials that we're creating, or because we are taking advantage of the fair use loopholes as far as we can, and we don't want to put anyone else at risk. So therefore, use it here, but please don't take it and reuse it in your own environment. So it really will depend upon the content.
So I'm certainly not opposed to any of these points of views. I think I think openness is really, really good and important in an educational context. And I think one of the problems with copyright law is that it does create some of those inadvertent rights walls, you might call them. Something is owned that somebody who owns it doesn't even realize they own it because copyright ownership attaches as soon as the work is fixed in a tangible medium. So I think actually Creative Commons is a rather brilliant way of trying to resolve or trying to knock down those walls. And what we just have to continue to work toward is making sure that people know when they can use these licenses, to give people more of an opportunity to use these licenses. And I think this goal of allowing people who want to share their information, the complete ability to share it, I think is a really good goal. And I think it should be supported. It's got to be done, I think, within the constraints of the law, and so that's something we have to work together on, and it's more than I think an individual effort.
Thanks. Looks like we have our own message board going as well on a particular question, so I'll kind of let that one flow a while because there's some good stuff basically talking about how do we convince faculty to You know, instead of having to create from scratch all the time, actually go out, seek other materials, and put them together. Oh yeah, we'll start with that video.
The web's transformed culture, it's transformed the way we do commerce, it's transformed the way we do advertising. The web's transformed culture, it's transformed the way we do commerce, it's transformed the way we do advertising, it's transformed the way we do entertainment. But science has been very little affected.
You're used to being able to get on the web and find relevant information pretty quickly, and you're used to being able to order books or other materials off of the web. But scientists can't do this when they're trying to cure malaria or to cure cancer.
When researchers, doctors, do their research, what they end up finding is a lot of it is in separate silos. Some are private silos, and some are silos that have just been built because that's where people store their information. People around the world who can make progress with scientific research don't have access to them, and the public doesn't have access to them.
Science Commons is a nonprofit project, and what we're trying to do is to make the web work for science the way that it works for culture.
What Science Commons can do is make research flow more easily.
I mean, scientists are the ultimate remixers. They're taking information from multiple different sources and trying to analyze it and say, well, how does this all work together? So we want to get that data up in a commons on the web so other users can use it for new uses, new experiments, new insights, and still give people who want some control an ability to keep some of that control.
We're not trying to interfere with rightful ownership of compounds, drugs, devices, but even these companies are recognizing that the upstream basic research that led to these discoveries needs to be shared.
If we can systematically increase our chances of making big discoveries and decrease the likelihood that we're ignoring information that we should be using, then that's the best chance we have to get these breakthroughs in understanding about our bodies and about drugs.
Because the world is filled with minds who can contribute, and when that information is shared, things just move faster.
The one comment I want to make about that is we have a lot of discussion about how Creative Commons and copyright affects creative works in the arts and humanities, but not necessarily in the sciences. And I think if you're going to make the argument to faculty in other areas, or to talk about agricultural science and the importance of sharing research as well as educational materials, something like Science Commons can kind of help them understand the importance of doing this. Jeanette and I were talking about how she and Aaron talked about using the blogs platform for something more than blogs, and then Jeanette used her son's materials to create that website, but then that shared with other people. And I didn't even know Jeanette before, but I used that as an example, and I'm sure Jeff Swain is going to use that as an example for the ePortfolio project. So when you do stuff in the open, it just kind of goes around and around and around, and other people just add their piece to it. And I just really enjoy that kind of creative flow, because that's really how this event is planned as well. It's done in the open. Somebody will post, hey, here's a place where I can generate my own business cards, and then the icons come up and the stickers are created, and people get ideas based on the stickers for other things that they want to do. We end up with camp t-shirts and all sorts of stuff, but that wouldn't happen if this was all just me planning this behind closed doors.
I thought it was interesting. Brad mentioned something about a change in workflow, and absolutely there is a change in workflow associated to all of this. And I can say it's definitely changed the way I start thinking about it and the way I start interacting with faculty from the very beginning, and the way I talk to our administration about the creation of these courses. First and foremost, I start to get a sense for the level of openness a faculty member actually has. And you can get that very quickly in an opening discussion with them. And then you start to propose different ways of thinking about this. If it's a very closed, or you start to see that there's an awful lot of material that is going to be copyrighted involved in the course, well, you can start to take one stance on it. But in another case, you can start to find out that the faculty member really has an open philosophy, but does not know how to get there. So what we can do then is start to, at least administratively at the beginning, start to figure out, well, let's help get you down that path of open education and help figure out what this means for you in your academic setting. So then once it's been at least determined, I'll state that, yeah, we're going to go through the course for copyright agreements and all of that, but let's have an end goal of being open when we're done with this, and we'll turn this back to you at the end. Then all of a sudden, though, we get down to the instructional design side. And over the past year, I've really started thinking more about and stressing to the instructional designers in my unit, how can we go about using these open materials? Most of this stuff is already created, so why bother creating it again? And how can we start to assemble this stuff into more meaningful educational resources that we can then give back? I'm going to continue to stress that and continue to figure it out. Now, what an interesting aspect to this is that what kind of assembly tool do we have now that is pervasive across the university? Angel. Well, that's a closed environment. All of a sudden, we're taking all these open resources, pumping them into a closed environment where only the students can see it for that class. So, we would have to start to see a cultural shift as to how we're going to display all of those open materials and communicate them not only to the students but to others as well. But yes, very much we have to change our instructional workflows associated to this.
I'm going to break the rule and not the question of the question, so we'll just ask it. Is it even legal to take a CC Share-alike piece of material and stick it into Angel? Because you're not sharing alike if you stuck it into a closed environment. Is that even legal to take a Creative Commons licensed work and put it somewhere closed? I'm not sure it is.
That's a great question, but I'm going to let the intellectual property lawyer answer that one.
I mean, it's not a legal question. It's a legal question, but it's a contractual question, right? So it really depends on what how the license is interpreted. But I think that's an interesting point. It sounds like for that type of license, that might be a real issue, and the person who. So we're going back to what the intent was of the person who adopted the license in the first place, and so think about it from their perspective. Would they have an objection to that? And under those circumstances, quite possibly.
I think it depends upon what share-alike applies to in this case. If my understanding of share-alike was that if you take the original material and then you transform it or incorporate it into a larger set, that needs to be that license of openness should carry with the whole thing. I don't know if you're just taking something that is openly available and moving it into Angel to be consumed as its whole thing. That may not be a violation of the license. That just may be a context of the use. I am not a lawyer on this. I'm just really trying to think about what the share-alike clause in Creative Commons licenses says and what it applies to, and I can't remember, but I'm sure Alan does.
A couple of things about that. First off, Creative Commons is meant to relax some of the copyright restrictions, right? So you probably could make the argument under the Teach Act that it would be okay, because you're allowed to use copyrighted materials inside a class environment, inside a lockdown environment for educational purposes. But considering that Angel is going to go through a radical transformation in the next few years. I mean, it will. Whether we stick with Blackboard or go with another system, Angel at some point ends. So I think it behooves us to do something like creating materials outside of Angel as much as we can in the next few years so we're not caught in that big transition. And, Stevie, I think you retweeted me or you quoted me on Twitter. If it doesn't need to be nailed down, it should be set free. So, when you can, I think it's kind of our responsibility to respect that Creative Commons and that share-alike thing and share it back.
Since you've instigated, you mentioned taking copyrighted materials or Creative Commons materials, and that Teach Act might actually cover that. That does beg a question as to what gets covered under Teach Act. And typically content and textual material is not a teach-acted type of material. It's digital images, media, and things like that. So the content itself would fall under a different use. Just wanted to kind of clarify that.
Can I add something? Actually, I want to spin off from something you said about when you said when Angel ends. And it was reminding me of a thread that's kind of persevered through here, which is that we assume the material will be open, the material will be there if we make it open. But if Angel ends, then access to certain kinds of content maybe is, or that tool is no longer around. If there are certain kinds of functionalities that are dependent upon Angel, we have to make sure those translate to whatever new system replaces it. I guess the question I want us to think about is what commitment does an institution make to one of you or to an instructor if the material is created with the assumption that it's going to be made open? What's the institutional commitment? How long does that stuff persevere? Does the institution have an obligation to keep it around forever? If it doesn't, then it's not going to remain open. If the material is created in such a way that it can't survive a migration to new platforms, openness has a very different meaning. And so I think we're talking about openness in the term very much in terms of legal issues here. But openness has a lot more to do, means a lot more than that. It means the technological openness and its ability to endure, and hidden in within this issue of making sure it's accessible is what we can do as organizations to ensure that material is continually discoverable, accessible, and usable. That's where financial issues really can come into play. And I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I will stop. I have some other things I could add to that.
I wanted to take one of the questions and kind of move in a bit of a different direction. We've talked about right now a lot of the content reuse as far as being an instructional designer, creating whether it be an online course or helping faculty put together basically the idea that we're creating presentation material, a faculty or a designer. This question talks about the students are increasingly putting more and more material together as part of what they do, and that's going to continue. And as far as these discussions about copyright and fair use and so forth, they simply don't care. And they see materials and they're very creative and they put it together, and that's what they do and that's what they have been doing. They're very used to that. So I guess I want to get this question down to, in light of what is going on with students putting stuff together, how do we protect them as an institution? And say, hey, you really can't do that. And what are some of the experiences? I like to start with Jeanette, because she's actually had some of these conversations with what she's doing with the blogs, trying to explain enough to the students to stay within the law, perhaps, but also be creative.
I have a video for that too.
That's like I have an ad for that.
Yeah, it's one of our bigger challenges. You have the Creative Commons work, but the students are lazy. They just like to Google things, I think, and just pull them off online randomly. And we talk about education, and sometimes I say, well, you could perhaps use this image because this is an educational setting, but I'm teaching them how to write professionally in the workplace, so they need to prepare for that. So I actually encourage them to do some of their own digital photography and create their own videos, and it's exciting that they can actually make this material. They don't have to just steal it, but it's a huge issue, and we have huge debates about what you can use and what you can't use. Our text author, he says that you can't use any images at all online, and so we have huge debates about that. And they talk about case law. The IST majors are aware of some of the case law, so it's a gray, scary area in the classroom when they post their work online, and some of it's borrowed, some of the images and such.
All right, do you guys want to see this video? It's really short. It stars Ryan. I actually run the copyright.psu.edu site, and this is really just a collection of tools, resources, and other things. It's about to go through a facelift, so if it doesn't look like this by the time you look at it. Yes, thank you. So there's going to be a Creative Commons tab that'll point you right to the Creative Commons license and include a video kind of geared towards people who create content and encouraging them to use a Creative Commons license. But this is a fun video that we made last summer with Ryan.
What's up, Ryan? Oh, hey, Ryan. You're all dressed up. We made it through college. Now I'm off to a job interview. Cool. I'm working on a video project for class. You should put this in our portfolio. Show them all what we can do. You know, I remember that project. Turns out really well, but I can't use it. Why not? You use copyrighted music without permission. I can't post this online. Really? It's that much of an issue? Yeah. In the professional world, employers take copyright very seriously. We have to show them that we take copyright seriously too. Okay, but I still need some music. Check out Creative Commons. They have a lot of music from a bunch of different artists, and you can use it in projects just like this. But is it any good? What we're listening to right now was made under a Creative Commons license. Okay, yeah, that's not bad. Thanks. No problem. I'm gonna head off to that job interview now. Good luck.
Give Ryan a hand, please. I like to embarrass him about that. So this is actually a pretty conservative view on using Creative Commons materials. If you had created, say if it was a piece about Bob Dylan, and you play some Bob Dylan songs, but then you're commenting about the song itself, you know, I think that would be fine. I think that'd be fair use because you're using it to actually, that's the focus of the content. But in this case, the music was just playing in the background. It was merely decorative, and you would really need permission to do that, but you could use Creative Commons resources. So at the end, there is actually a credit here saying where we got the music, that we got it from Jamendo.com, and that's what a lot of the Digital Commons group does. So they're very versed on these types of issues that your students will be running into. So I would definitely talk to Digital Commons, and they can, you know, do a consultation with your students or anything like that. It's a good resource.
Yeah, one aspect that we haven't even hit on yet is the fact that Teach Act, if we start to use that in the classroom settings, or sorry, the online settings, it applies to student work as well. So, you know, it's not just faculty giving the presentation. I think today all we've talked about is the presentation of material, not the evaluation of students' materials. So, you know, the same rules apply to student works that are being submitted for coursework. The other thing is looking at things like videos and mashups of using different technologies. It is a teachable moment for students because as they're going out and creating their e-portfolios and things like that, the more we can teach them and guide them in how to use these open materials, the better off we are. So I did want to throw in the fact that, you know, Teach Act does apply to students as well in their works and creations for assignments.
I think it's important to have a discussion with students. It doesn't have to be a scary discussion. It doesn't have to be an admonition that everyone in the class will go to jail if they do things the wrong way, at least not for copyright. I think you can direct people to principles that will allow them to think about it on their own. I think what we have to work hard to do, and this is probably the initial hurdle, is to get people past thinking about straight, what can I do, what can't I do? That's especially prevalent, I think, in the business school. You know, we all have a tendency, I think, to say, what are the rules? What's legal? What's illegal? And unfortunately, copyright law is not that clear. But you can move toward, I think, more openness by just engaging in a risk assessment. And I think that's the way you look at this process. And so what you teach students is the risk assessment tool. And that's by discussing the principles, I think the fair use factors, maybe discussing some general ideas of the Teach Act. It doesn't have to be detailed. It doesn't have to be a book. Maybe just directing them to some resources initially. So you have that discussion before there are any issues, and then let people take responsibility. So I think that's the way I deal with it in my classes. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add that one of the things that is, would concern us is that if you ask any one of us on this table right now a question about some specific area of license or copyright law, we're probably going to give slightly different answers. With the rules and the laws are complex enough for all of us to have slightly different understandings of them, and I think in an educational environment that's usually fine, but when the students are going to talk to different people and they might get different takes, they're going to be very confused after a while. So I think one of the things we have to do is continually have conversations like this, do more about copyright and license education among ourselves, and kind of put some focus on that. The other thing I would say, though, is that there is really no kind of critical thinking skill like having to kind of piece your way through a justification for fair use of some copyrighted or licensed materials, or really copyrighted materials, I should say. So it's a great teaching opportunity for students to kind of work through and kind of evaluate. Here's what this thing is. What is it? Where does it fit on this continuum of use? So.
I just had a question, and this can actually go to anyone, but in creating the Biology 12 course, and I'm an instructional designer, and we just took material and put it in there, and we assumed it was pretty much good to go. I'm wondering what so far here at Penn State has been the worst case scenario of any violation of copyright. What has been the consequence? I mean, is it even from a cease and desist, I mean, to just maybe a legal letter. But does anybody have any examples of went too far and we got caught?
Not teaching, but back in the mid-90s, we got an email from Matt Groening's lawyer saying someone had a Simpsons picture in his personal homepage and that had to go. And that came from a lawyer and said, and we emailed the guy and said, the lawyers told us that's to go. So the students do that and they don't think about it. So
right.
That was 12 years ago.
Okay.
Didn't representatives of the music industry threaten to shut down a server in astronomy a couple years ago because they saw a bunch of downloads of Usher materials? They thought it was the musician Usher, but it was some retired professor named Usher. This is like finals. They said we're going to shut down this astronomy server. And it was a huge, ridiculous scenario. Got a lot of attention. People remember that.
Oh, that one.
Really, the worst thing that I've seen happen, I mean, in the residence halls, students will get a notice every once in a while saying that they're sharing music or something like that. And so far, it's been kind of a cease and desist. They can, fine you for every violation, but these days, even on YouTube, it's more like an automatic takedown notice. And that happens a lot, actually. If you type takedown notice on YouTube, you'll get examples of people saying, I shared something, I cleared the copyright, or it was fair use, and I got this automatic takedown notice from YouTube. Because what they'll do is they'll scan for kind of the music signatures in the background, and if they notice that you're basically violating copyright, they can take that down. Then you have to write back to them and say, no, that was illegal use, or no, it's not a violation of copyright. And we actually went to this conference, this open video conference in New York City just a few weeks ago with some of the Digital Commons people, and they were talking about how those notices are actually fraudulent because they don't check whether you've actually violated copyright or not, or if it falls under fair use before they will do these takedowns. So it's complicated, but just Google that term. I don't think our students are in a lot of danger, especially if it's a one-time thing and they're not actually running boxes or trying to sell anything. But it's just something students need to be aware of, because like in that video, if Ryan were creating movies and then he would go to the RIAA and try to apply for a job there, and then they see that he's using copyrighted videos in his projects or copyrighted music in his projects, they might be disinclined to give this kind of loose cannon a job.
Just an example that comes up with a great deal of frequency, actually, for the libraries. Materials that we have licensed from large publishers, we occasionally get a notice from the publisher that says we're limiting or shutting you down right now because there has been systematic downloading of our database, systematic mining, copying of this. And sometimes that's been students running, you know, a CS experiment, maybe aren't really thinking about what they're doing there, we might have a license that would forbid you from downloading 1 million articles all at once. Sometimes it's been faculty we've had to have that conversation with as well. So, you know, that's a little bit unusual, but it's, you know, even if that stuff's not going to be shared, it's really just for local use for text mining and analysis purposes. You know, our contractual agreement forbids that kind of what they determine to be excessive use. So.
I guess that you'd want to probably separate in your minds the difference between, you know, students who are downloading music where there's fairly egregious and probably knowledgeable infringement versus difficult fair use issues, which you don't really hear a lot about. There probably aren't a lot of cases like that, so I don't think we have a lot of examples, although I think Mike's is really interesting. Other areas where you probably deal with are things like course reserves, or other ways that faculty find material to post online without thinking about, do they have a license to do that? But I'm not privy nor otherwise aware of any actions against the university for that. So.
Okay, we got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to hit a question I think is kind of relevant here on the board, and then just anyone who wants to provide some final thoughts, they can do so. Let me just scroll down here and find it. And Stevie asked this, and I think she's done it a couple times in here, but talking about content that you can reuse and modify. What are the implications of modifying content that you've used? And you know, are there restrictions on that? I know I've done that in the past. Again, you know, I don't really look to what the legal issues are with content. I had the mentality still that, oh, if it's on the internet, I can use it and figure out a way to design around it and modify it. So once again, Dan, I'll have you lead this off and get it started.
Well, so modification is a problem. Just because you modify a copyrighted work doesn't necessarily, doesn't at all get you out of copyright. The copyright owners have the ability to control derivative works, which would be a modification. So, but that doesn't necessarily prevent you from modifying it, right? Because it's contextual. If you can make, say, for example, a fair use argument, a modification may be perfectly permissible. If the person who owns the content says, like with a Creative Commons license, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want with it, modify it, just give me credit. That's fine too. So there are probably 1,000 ways you can do it, but it's probably worth thinking about the one way that might be a problem.
I guess one of the ways I think about modification is you know, it could be rewriting, or it could be editing, or it could be you know, a substantial change to it. I also think about like changing the context for it. That, you know, sometimes if you take something out of a particular context, put it in another, you're in many ways changing the meaning of it. Others may not care to have its meaning changed in that way, but you know, that might be less of a problem, except for when you might actually provoke an infringement claim more readily if you're using a particular work in a particular way that the originator doesn't care for. I actually think the bigger struggle here is, how do we ensure the discoverability of the resources in all these places so people can find them and reuse them? And there's been a question floating throughout the board there about DIY, and how do we convince people not to simply say they've got to fix it themselves and do it their own way. And this really relates exactly to that. How do you convince people that what they've got there is actually good enough, or suits the purposes in some way? Or, you know, and the other side of that is, how do we convince ourselves as technologists that we don't have to create our own tools and our own systems, that we can easily just kind of lift from somebody else, rather than assuming we all have to do it ourselves? I mean, that's a real challenge. It's not really to the point of the question, but it's something I worry about a lot. So.
I can't say as if at this point we've really gotten into having to change materials, and you know, for the most part I think faculty have taken it and used it as it is. Most of what we've done internally has been internal reuse too, and we've seen some reuse within our own courses, moving across from different music courses or things like that. So we haven't really gotten into the issue of, you know, what it means to maybe change the context of the content or the material. And in certain cases, if it's a media file, we may go back to the original source and ask, maybe more of what the intent of that image was, and try to validate what it is that we're proposing to do as a mashup of it.
My students are modifying a lot of the images that they find online to meet the purposes of their technical descriptions. And I think it's important that they note on the page that there was an original author and that the modifications were made. And that's how we're handling it. And it's quite common, the students modifying work. I have it myself.
One of the things that is in these questions, and I think is also relevant, maybe we could have this in the open forum in the next session, is how the Blogs at Penn State plays into all this. Because Matt's using the Blogs at Penn State platform to release his content in the open, and we might be able to use the Pack It Up tool to actually help get that material out. Jeanette, you're using that as well? Okay, Cole's saying it's easier than that. Keith, you're using an open platform. You're using Drupal now, right? But I think that would be a good discussion, because even yesterday when we were talking about digital scholarship, a lot of those faculty were using the Blogs at Penn State tool. So I think it really cuts across a lot of topics. It'd be a good kind of wrap-up discussion.
Yeah, one of the things I think that is most frustrating for me is that while we're moving into these other areas and other technologies, we're still kind of closing them into those technologies, if you will. One of the limitations that I see, even with us, what we've done in the Drupal environment is that, well, if a faculty member wants to take that and reuse that, but they want to do it in the Blogs at Penn State, I want to see them be able to do that. And Brian, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but this is going to be something that we're going to have to go down the path on. But we have an API. So, yeah, I mean, those are things that I think need to be explored. And I know we've talked about it. I've talked about it with my column with WebLion, too, as well. As, I would like to be able to see faculty choose the tools that they want to be able to display their materials in. And, otherwise, we're creating just new constraints for the faculty and how they want to display and reuse this material. So I think that's a next big step with it. It's nice that we have these open platforms. There are a lot of APIs out there that allow things to communicate. And it's a matter of making it work for us.
Okay, well, that puts an end to this discussion. I think this is obviously a topic that is constantly changing, not quickly, but it's something that we should always keep an eye on from a learning design standpoint. I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for being here this morning. It was great to have you here. Thank everyone for all your great questions and helping make this a much easier job to do the moderation for. And Alan, thanks for the videos.
Right now we're going into a break. Please go out.